Welcome, World History class. Today's lesson is all about the Reformation. We're going to go through the Reformation very, very quickly today. This is going to be a major part of church history class. Today, I'm going to give you just kind of the quick rundown on everything, because this is still very important to world history, but we'll go much, much more into detail about this next year. So I'm going to kind of give you the Cliff Notes, the Spark Notes version of everything. So what was going on during this time? This is always what we have to ask at the beginning of every history video. Is that going to become my catchphrase? Let's find out. So what was going on during this time? We're at about the year 1510 right now. That's kind of the era that we're talking about. The humanists were claiming that the church was not setting a good moral example for the people of Europe. Instead, they were acting like political leaders and warriors. They were concerned with the details of ceremonies, and they were concerned with their income, how much money they were making. The humanists sought a new emphasis on personal faith and spirituality, rather than kind of the rituals that were going on in the church at the time, where the average person didn't really know enough about Christian doctrine. That was not the average person really knew much about Christianity in general. What was actually in the Bible? Most people couldn't read the Bible. It was just whatever your local priest told you, that was the truth, and that was it. And so this comes to a head here with the Protestant Reformation. And this building here, this is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. It's one of the most beautiful buildings in the world. It's the biggest church on the face of the planet, and funding it during this time was very, very expensive. Well, what happened? There's this guy named Pope Leo. He needed money to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica in Rome to be what we see today. There's this guy going around. His name was Johann Tetzel. He was selling indulgences or pardons from punishment for sin. So basically, an indulgence as it existed, there's the belief in purgatory, which was a place you went to before you went to heaven, and you would be sanctified there for a long period of time, maybe hundreds of years. It was a very unpleasant place to be. The idea went that if you just paid in this life, the church could actually make it so the people who you knew who were in purgatory would be saved from their torment and go directly to heaven. So this is how they funded a lot of the building of St. Peter's Basilica. The humanists wanted the church to be more spiritual and less concerned with collecting money for fancy buildings. Well, there's one guy who's really going to lead the whole powder keg of the Protestant Reformation. It's going to be Martin Luther. This guy, he was a German monk. He was actually originally trained to be a lawyer, but what made him change careers? Well, basically he got caught in a thunderstorm, and he said, he called out to Saint Anne, who was this famous saint, and he said, if I survive this storm, I'll become a monk. And so that's what he did. He survived. He went and became a monk and led a life of spirituality and understanding religion more. He was concerned that the church's methods and rituals for overcoming sin gave him no comfort. He was agonized with the fact that he would do everything that the church told him to. He would live the most moral life he could, but he still had this feeling that it wasn't enough. So what kind of changed his opinions? Eventually, one day, he was reading the Bible. I think it's the very beginning of Romans, where it says, "By faith alone." And this really was a revelation to him, that Jesus saves through belief, not through your actions here on earth. And the way that everything had been going with the church was that it was so ritualized that it was all about like making sure you did the right things on earth to be saved. And Luther found out something completely different after reading the Bible more. He believed that as long as people did not rely on their own actions, but believed God would save them, they would receive salvation by God's grace. He believed it was God's grace, not our human actions, that really save us. Thus, he believed Tetzel was asking people to give up their money for a false promise, and that was a crime. So basically, to protest what was going on in the church at the time, he nailed up what are known as the 95 Theses. And that was on October 31st, 1517, about 503 years ago. And so we just celebrated the 500th anniversary of Luther nailing up the 500 theses that he came up with against the sale of indulgences, because he started not to believe in purgatory, and he started to believe that all these things that were done by the church to kind of gain money were all illegal. He finally had an open disagreement with the church. His beliefs was that the Bible was the sole religious authority, that God viewed all people of faith equally, that popes and bishops cannot tell people what to believe, and that ceremonies do not counteract sin. Pope Leo X declared Luther a heretic and excommunicated him. So we have the church being very much against what Luther is saying, but Luther is trying to change the church for the better. That's really his goal here. His goal was not to start a revolution, it was to reform the Catholic Church. The Reformation, reform, make it more closely allied to what's actually said in the Bible. But the leaders of the Catholic Church were having none of it and declared him a heretic, excommunicated him. They thought that would be the end of the problem. However, it wasn't. Luther's ideas were very influential, and they influenced other people. And remember, we just had the invention of the printing press, so his ideas did not just die with him being called a heretic. His ideas actually spread all throughout Europe, and they influenced other people as well. And we're going to be talking about the people he influenced. Germany became the center of the Lutheran Church, which was much more like the kind of churches that we see in America today. This is where we have, pews, and we have a pastor, and it's much less, there's much less decoration. It's much more plain compared to the churches at the time. And his ideas were spreading rapidly about how to actually live the Christian faith out. And there were different kinds of sects that were going around. One of them was the Anabaptists. Those were the people who believed that you needed to be baptized as an adult, and that a baptism as a child did not count. And these people were kind of more extreme. So, Luther started it, but then much more extremist groups came after him who, started openly fighting with church authorities, and eventually all these civil wars start going on. So Luther tried to change things, and he ended up causing this avalanche of wars and civil fighting for the next 100 years. He had no idea how big of a storm this was going to be. And then eventually the Anglican Church starts from King Henry VIII. He wanted a divorce from one of his wives, and the church wouldn't give it to him. So he decided, well, I can just start my own church. That's all the rage right now. So this is why we have all these different churches starting. So we have Protestantism here, we have the Calvinist sect, which we're going to be talking about next, and that became a big deal in Scotland as well, in places like Belgium and the Netherlands and France and Switzerland here. And then Lutheranism really spread to Germany, because that's where Martin Luther was from. Calvinism. There was more religious conflict in Europe. There's this guy named Zwingli, and Calvin was one of his students. Calvin wrote down his beliefs in what's known as the Institutes of the Christian Religion. He agreed with Luther that faith and the Bible are the most important things. Just making sure that it is your belief that really matters, not so much what you do here on earth. It's basically that you do good things because you are saved. You don't do good things to get saved. He invented this new idea, though, and this is known as predestination. This is going to become very important to the spread of Calvinism. What is predestination? It's that there is an elect group of people, that God at the beginning of the universe selected people to be his elect. And they're expected to live up to their position by following higher moral standards. It's that the people who, that there is a certain group of people who have been chosen to be Christians, and it's up to them to live up to their position. These standards included things like being devout, dislike of frivolity, self-discipline, attendance at service, basically very, very conservative sorts of views, just to show that you are part of this elect. And this is where things get pretty interesting. He was in the city called Geneva and it actually became a theocracy. This is what Geneva looks like today. Back when John Calvin was there, it was not, didn't have that nice fountain there. So basically, he was actually put in charge of this whole city, where he basically made it the hub of Calvinism and what Calvin believed. So he regulated the conduct of the citizens down to the smallest detail. He made laws against card playing, showy dress, and profane language. So no playing Magic the Gathering, no dressing up for spirit days, and no foul language. So these are, and that was a crime to do any of those things. His ideas were very influential, and they spread to France, where converts were known as Huguenots. And there are still many Calvinist churches today, even the ones nearby us here in Sunnyside, like the Christian Reformed Church and United Reformed Church, the URC. These are both rooted in Calvinism, which really became a big deal, especially in the Netherlands and the Low Countries, where my ancestors were from. So Calvinism is a big deal to a lot of us. We'll go much, much more in depth about it when you get to church history. In England, this became known as Puritanism. You might remember that word, Puritans, or eventually who will become the Pilgrims. They were very much influenced by Calvin's ideas as well. Well, the Catholic Church, despite being very large, it's still very organized. They're not going to take this challenge lying down. They have this Counter-Reformation at the same time. So in the 1530s, the Counter-Reformation was kicked off by the Catholics. It was an aggressive campaign against the Protestants. There's a shift in power from Italy in Rome to actually these countries like Spain and Portugal being like the main centers of the Catholic faith. Most of the popes will still be from Italy for the time being and going forward, but Spain is really going to become like the most fervent the most fervent Catholics out there, and they're going to actually export kind of their faith and their religious fervor to the Americas when they go over to places like Mexico and Peru and the New World, and they're going to spread Catholicism there. That's why even today, the Americas, North America, Central America, South America, are still very much shaped by the Catholics. And the Catholicism in general. That's why it's now kind of like the center of Catholicism, as opposed to the way it started with Italy being the center of it. It's very interesting what's happened there. The Counter-Reformation, though, how did the Catholics try to stop the Protestants? Well, they had something called the Inquisition, especially in Spain. That's the famous joke about the Spanish Inquisition, where some countries, especially countries like Spain and Portugal, they had their kings and queens were very pro-Catholic and anti-Protestant. Most leaders at this time had to either choose one. It's like you were either a Catholic king or you were a Protestant king. You had to choose one, and the other would be, thrown out of your country or against the law to be one of those. And Spain was most definitely Catholic. So they tried to expel any other religion out. This is also where they were trying to purge any kind of Jewish or Islamic faith that still existed in Spain, and they basically would sometimes even torture people to make them convert. At this time, there was the Council of Trent. This defined the official church doctrine. It banned the sale of indulgences. It tightened the discipline of the clergy. It made them kind of live more monastic lives again, less worldly, less money, and they emphasized the need for ceremony still. It's like that's really going to still define us. But did it work? Well, the answer is yes. The Counter-Reformation was pretty successful. It's kind of funny because the Counter-Reformation ended up kind of fixing the church in the way that Luther originally wanted, without so much warfare and strife that ended up happening. So it's kind of, he did get his wish eventually, where the Catholic Church did reform itself, but it took so much suffering before we got there. What were the results of religious upheaval? Results of religious upheaval. There we go. Results of religious. If you think it's hard for me to say, try saying it yourself. It's not as easy as it looks. There were many different churches in Western Europe. That's what ended up happening. There's new interest in education and reading. This is because the Protestants wanted their children and they wanted other people to be able to read the Bible. Before, not many people could read because it was hard to get a hold of reading material. Remember, all books had to be copied by hand. Now that we have the printing press and everyone can read the Bible, it became very important to make sure everyone could read, everyone was literate, everyone was educated so they could participate in Bible study. So that was very important. This, however, did not lead to more tolerance. It kind of led to people being, this is my sect, this is my belief, and everyone else is wrong, and it's okay to fight them. So this is one time where just becoming more educated did not exactly lead to more tolerance. And eventually the domino effect is that, you're going to have people like the Pilgrims end up going to America, and you're going to have these religious debates, end in sometimes brutal civil wars. Here's a painting of one of these big riots that ended up happening between Catholics and Protestants. And then finally, it increased the power of the national government, and it decreased the power of the Pope. Local kings and local governments became stronger. The Catholic Church was never as powerful as it was in the lives of ordinary people ever again. It never had the kind of all-consuming power it had during the medieval ages again. So it's going to lead to people becoming... it's still very religious during this time, especially in Europe, but it's never going to be the same again where your life is defined, by, following church schedules and church ritual in the way it was during the medieval ages. So it's a big change. And we're going to be talking about the next thing we're going to be talking about is one of the results of all of this upheaval, and it's going to be the Enlightenment. So join us next time. We're going to be talking all about the Enlightenment and all the things that happen in regards to that, because it's going to be more and more people trying to understand what is right, what we can do to make a more perfect government, a better society. What are all the ways that we can, improve ourselves? And that's really going to be the crux of the Enlightenment and the thinking that still shapes us today. So join me for that. All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening.